They all see a broken Omega, a girl with no bite, a silent shadow in the royal court. And Joanne prefers it that way. Because in a kingdom ruled by claws and cruelty, being invisible is the only way to stay alive. For years she has survived on the scraps of affection from the man she thought was her destiny, the man she was born to serve. Alphaleri. But tonight the shadows can no longer hide her. Under the cold, judgmental glare of the entire kingdom, the perfect mating ceremony is about to become a public execution of her dignity. One cold look. One brutal word. Rejected. Suddenly Joanne's world isn't just falling apart. It's being torn to shreds by the one person who was supposed to protect her. As she collapses onto the freezing marble, the court's laughter begins to rise like a tide. But it's cut short by a sound that makes the very foundations of the castle tremble. The air turns to ice. The laughter dies. A massive shadow stretches across the hall, eclipsing the light of the silver moon. It's him. The Black Wolf. Lord Liam. He isn't here to negotiate. He isn't here for peace. He has come to claim the one thing Larry was too blind to value. And as Joanne looks up through her tears, she realizes that the end of her life as an Omega is actually the beginning of her reign as a queen. She was standing at the center of the great hall when she realized she was about to lose her soul. The court was a sea of velvet and fur, hundreds of high-ranking shifters leaning forward with predatory hunger in their eyes. They weren't here to celebrate a union. They were here to witness a fall. Joanne clutched the fabric of her lace wedding gown, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She shouldn't have been this afraid. She was supposed to be the bride. But as she looked at Alpha Larry standing on the raised dais, his red fur mantle glowing like fresh blood under the torches, she didn't see a mate. She saw a judge. The pressure in the room was suffocating. Every whisper felt like a needle. Beside Larry stood Karina, her lips curled in a triumphant, jagged smile. This girl, Larry's voice boomed, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. This Omega has spent years clinging to my shadow, pretending to be worthy of a king's mark. Today we see her for what she truly is. Joanne felt the first sob catch in her throat. She looked at Larry, searching for a spark of the boy who had once promised to protect her. But his pale eyes were as hard as flint. I, Alpha Larry of the Silver Moon, formally and eternally reject Joanne as my mate. He spat, the words hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She is weak. She is barren. She is nothing. The court exploded. Jeers, laughter, and insults rained down on her. Joanne's knees gave out and she hit the stone floor, her veil fluttering around her like a broken wing. She wanted to run, to disappear into the woods and let the winter take her, but her legs wouldn't move. She met Larry's eyes one last time across the expanse of the hall. I loved you, she thought. I gave you everything. And then the heavy iron doors at the far end of the hall groaned. The sound was so loud, so violent, that the entire court fell into a deathly silence. A man stepped through the mist. He was a mountain of steel and dark fur, a jagged gold crown resting atop a mane of dark hair. Lord Liam. The rival king. The man mothers used to frighten their children into silence. He walked past the guards, past the council, his heavy boots echoing like a heartbeat against the marble. He didn't look at Larry. He didn't look at Karina. His eyes were fixed solely on the girl trembling on the floor. He stopped directly in front of Joanne. The atmosphere shifted from the cold sting of rejection to the suffocating heat of a storm. He reached out a gauntlet hand, his expression unreadable, his presence towering over her. The Silver Moon is a fool. Leon's voice was a low growl that vibrated in Joanne's very marrow. He throws away a diamond because he is too dim-witted to see the light. He looked up then, meeting Larry's shocked gaze. You rejected her before your court, Leon declared, his voice rising until it shook the rafters. So I shall marry her before the entire kingdom. And heaven help the wolf who tries to stand in my way. Joanne closed her eyes, took a breath, and reached for the king's hand. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know if our story goes as far as America, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Africa. Chapter 1: The Cold Altar. The lace of the wedding gown felt like a shroud against Joanne's skin, cold and suffocating. She stood at the center of the great hall, her eyes fixed on Alpha Larry, the man who had been her North Star since childhood. The scent of pine and incense usually brought her peace, but today it was choked out by the metallic tang of Larry's sudden, sharp aggression. Beside him, draped in silk that matched the silver moon crest, Karina leaned back, her lips curved into a jagged, knowing smirk. The court was silent, a sea of expectant faces waiting for the bond to seal, but Larry didn't reach for her hand. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step back, his face hardening into a mask of pure disdain. The words he spoke next didn't just break the silence, they shattered her life. He called her weak, a parasitic Omega who had clung to his status for too long, and with a voice that echoed off the high stone rafters, he formally rejected her. He claimed Karina as his true mate, his voice booming with a cruelty that made the marble floor feel like it was giving way beneath Joanne's feet. As the court erupted into jeers and laughter, the very people she had grown up with now mocking her shame, Joanne collapsed. Her veil fluttered around her like the wings of a dying bird, and she tucked her head into her hands, wishing the earth would simply swallow her whole. But the laughter didn't last. A sudden violent boom shook the cathedral doors, a sound so heavy it silenced the mocking crowd in an instant. The massive iron entrance groaned open, and a shadow longer and darker than any in the hall stretched across the floor. Lord Leon, the legendary Black Wolf of the rival kingdom, stepped into the light. He was a mountain of steel and dark fur, his jagged gold crown glinting under the torches like a warning. He didn't look at the guards who scrambled for their blades, and he didn't look at Larry who stood frozen on the dais. His eyes were locked solely on Joanne, the rejected girl trembling in the dust. He walked toward her with the steady rhythmic gait of a predator that had already won. Stopping directly in front of her, he cast a shadow that shielded her from the hateful glares of the Silver Moon pack. Without a word of negotiation, Leon reached down, his gauntlet hand appearing in her field of vision like a lifeline. He spoke not to the court but to her, his voice a low, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. He told the room that Larry was a fool who couldn't recognize a diamond, and then, before the gasping aristocracy, he offered her more than just protection. He offered her his crown. When Joanne's fingers finally met his cold steel armor, the atmosphere in the room shifted from the sting of betrayal to the electric charge of a rising storm. Chapter 3. The journey across the border was a blur of mist and freezing wind. Joanne sat wrapped in a heavy fur cloak inside Leon's black carriage, her heart racing with every mile that took her further from the only home she had ever known. She had heard the stories of the Black Ridge Pack, tales of a bloodthirsty king and a kingdom built on bones. She waited for the cruelty to begin, for Leon to show the jagged edges of his reputation. Yet, as they crossed into his lands, she saw something she hadn't expected. The villages were thriving, the people stood tall with a sense of genuine loyalty rather than fear, and the laws were enforced with a fairness that put Larry's impulsive rule to shame. Leon remained silent for most of the ride, a brooding presence in the corner, but he ensured she was fed and warm, his gaze lingering on her with a strange, protective intensity that she couldn't yet name. Chapter 4. Once settled within the obsidian walls of his fortress, the true work began. Leon didn't treat her like a fragile trophy or a broken victim. He took her to the high cliffs overlooking the jagged peaks and told her the truth that had been hidden from her for 18 years. She was no ordinary Omega. He spoke of a dormant power, a voice of the queen, that could command the very soul of a wolf. Under the silver light of the moon he began her training. He pushed her to find the roar buried beneath her whispers, forcing her to stand against the wind until she could feel the ancient magic stirring in her blood. It was grueling and intense, a physical and emotional stripping away of the weakness Larry had forced her to believe in, replaced by a steel-cold resolve. Chapter 5. But as Joanne's power grew, so did the shadows within the palace. Sally, a high-ranking warrior and a woman who had once occupied a place at Leon's side, watched from the balconies with eyes full of venom. She saw the way Leon looked at Joanne when he thought no one was watching, and the jealousy burned like acid. One evening, as Joanne rested in the gardens, Sally approached her with a false mask of sympathy. She began to whisper poison, claiming that Leon was only using Joanne as a political pawn to humiliate Larry, and that